This is the center of the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland. That huge red building there houses a hospital, and we see patients there, and as well as a lot of normal individuals for doing studies. I chose just to use the word freedom in this because it's the term that Kornhuber used. Actually, when Kornhuber was first trying to look for the Bereitschaft potential, he actually was interested in free will from the very beginning, and it's all described in this book if you haven't seen it. So when I first started learning about the motor system, this was a very popular diagram in many of the textbooks. John Eccles won the Nobel Prize and was a very important physiologist, and this is the way that he viewed the way that the brain was organized to make voluntary movements, and to have all this different parts and stuff here in terms of the basal ganglia, the cerebellum, and the motor cortex to make movements. And then over there on the left side was this idea that was of the movement that was separated by a gap. No one really ever discussed that at the time, but that was sort of the concept that Eccles had about the way that the brain operated. And to a certain extent, that is the common view, the folk psychology view of the way that free will is. That is, that there's a conscious sense of wanting to make a movement, and then that somehow impinges itself on the motor system and makes a movement. And that's the sort of thing that was embodied in that picture from Eccles. And people do have the sense that W precedes M, that the will precedes the idea of, precedes the actual movement, and that gives rise to this particular flow of the way things are organized. Now, in terms of the way that the brain is, that we know the brain is organized these days, there is a decision to move that can be created. Generally, that's comes from the mesial motor structures in the frontal lobe and the premotor cortices. And it has a lot of inputs of various kinds to it that give rise to that decision to move in different circumstances. Emotions play an important role in different things coming from the limbic system input. Homeostatic impulses from the hippocampus play an important influence. Things that have been rewarded in the past, mediated by dopaminergic processes, tend to have people to do things again. We talked in the morning session about the sensory influences over the posterior half of the brain, producing different things in terms of reacting to sensory stimuli, cognitive things coming from the frontal lobe of various kinds, and then there probably is a little factor of noise that is there as well in terms of finally influencing decision to move. And then that box is this box over here. This is the sort of brain's intention. And when there is some sort of intention, then it will impinge upon the movement generation system, which is largely the primary motor cortex, which will create the movement. There are feed-forward signals in the brain, so both from those parts of the brain that create intention and from movement generation itself will feed forward to the brain saying, look, we've just issued a motor command. And there's also feedback from the movement itself, that there is a movement that has been made, and the concatenation of feed forward and feedback can give rise to the qualia of willing and agency. That the brain has issued a command, it's happened, and the brain is then the agent of that particular action. So that then gives rise to another potential model of the way the system works, differently from the folk psychology view of the situation. And I could refer to it as a perception model. And that is that the motor system makes a movement and somehow informs consciousness that this whole process is taking place. And then that would mean then that free will is a quality. It is one of those things that is in consciousness, being completely passive. It's something that notes that this operation has taken place. And to a certain extent, W can be actually after M in that circumstance. It doesn't actually have to be before M, just as long as it's thought to be before M. Now, in terms of the evidence for where M and W are, I think everybody knows the Limbic experiments. I'm not going to repeat those here to talk about those. But let me say that there's a couple of things that were very powerful experiments in my own thinking about this. And one of them is this experiment from Lau that shows that using transcranial magnetic stimulation over the premotor cortex, pre-supplementary motor area, but not the motor cortex, can influence what people say about where M and W are, even if the magnetic stimulation is after the movement. So in this particular diagram here, intention is actually W. I don't know why he used intention rather than W, since that's what I was talking about, and M is the movement. And without going into the details of these graphs, this is when the magnetic stimulation is delivered at the time of the movement. This is 200 milliseconds after the movement. And these are the shifts in the time of W up to 200 milliseconds from when the time of W would be reported if the TMS was given 200 milliseconds after the movement. You'd have a change in 20 milliseconds in terms of when W would actually be reported. So this seemed very strange that you could, this is supposed to be something that is observed prior to movement, but you can influence what people say even with the stimulus after the movement. There's a recent result from work that B.U. He did at the NIH, which I helped her with, which has some similar type of information in it. In this particular experiment, B.U. was trying to modify M and W, the sort of sense of where those happen, by using transcranial direct current stimulation of the brain. So she employed focal direct current stimulation to various places in the brain to see if this would then modify what people thought of as the timing of M and W. Now that did occur. So these are M times. There is sham stimulation, angular gyrus stimulation, supplement SMA stimulation, and M1 stimulation. M time didn't vary. But there was, and this is sham, and there was no effect of SMA anodal current, but over the angular gyrus and over M1, there was a change in what people reported as W time. So you could, in fact, influence W by giving transcranial stimulation. But the point that I want to make about this is that there were correlates in the EEG to the change in W. Here is looking at the Bereitschaft potential type recordings in relation to these experiments. And this is the lateralized readiness potential, which is the subtraction of the left and right hemisphere of the Bereitschaft potential, and black is sham and green is angular gyrus and nodal stimulation. And in this circumstance, you can see that there's a change in the lateralized readiness potential, and in this region here, you could actually predict what the change in W might be. That's actually before the movement. But here's one that's after the movement. If you looked at the Bereitschaft potential as measured in the parietal area, then from this half second's worth is different when the angular gyrus is being stimulated. And you can predict what people will say about W from the EEG potential after the movement. So here's another evidence of things going on after the movement will influence what people say was in fact W. Now, this all seems very strange until you realize that something which is really very important is that we live in the past. We actually don't live in the exact time that we think we are. And even though that may sound strange when I first say it, it really has to be true, and it's relatively obvious that it's true once you begin to think about it. If you see something, that has to have gotten into your, through your eye, into your occipital cortex, and you have to process it. That takes at least several hundred milliseconds. So when you're experiencing something, that actually happened several hundred milliseconds ago. So that your subjective present is actually several hundred milliseconds behind the real world time. So we are living just slightly behind what's happening in the real world. So let's take Limbic's data, which are diagrammed here. This is the time course, this is readiness potential 1 that he called, this is readiness potential 2, W, M, and S. You all know about those. And so these are the data, and you can then divide them into those things that are real world times. So like the readiness potential and the EMG onset and the time of the shock, those are real world events. And then the other events, W, M, and S, are subjective. And these are the times that they are ascribed. So if you add this curve and this curve, you'll get Limbic data. But the actual time has to be a little bit later, since we're living in the past. So it is conceivable, if you have to move W back a couple hundred milliseconds, that it's actually occurring after the movement, even though it's ascribed to be in front of the movement. And so this would be a way of summarizing all of the events. The earliest manifestation of movement by fMRI from John's work was perhaps 8 seconds even before movement. The onset of the Bereitschaft potential is a little more than 2 seconds before movement. T time is something I don't have time to talk about. That comes out of the Matsuhashi and Hallet experiment, which I could describe later, but I think it was brought up earlier. And then you have M and W, and W is referred, even though it may be happening after movement, is referred subjectively in time to before movement. And that's why it is experienced that particular way. So the quality of willing seems to follow the brain's decision to move, and hence it really can't be causal for the movement. Now, if that's the case, how can we explain W? Where does it come from? And there's a lot of research being done in that area. I've already mapped how I thought that agency came about. And one can actually study that in a lot of detail. And a number of people have done it. Let me just show you our experiment that we've done in this regard, looking at this. To get an arrow here. Right. Okay, good. Have to get an arrow. Okay, here we go. So what we did in this circumstance is the following. What we had people do is put their hand in a data glove, and that's here on this side of the picture, and that controlled a picture of the hand that you could see on a computer screen, people moved their hand and they could see the computerized hand move. And after a while, you begin to get the sense that you're the agent of that. In fact, you are. But then what we could do is modulate the computer hand differently from the hand movement, so we could alter the sense of agency by a variable proportion. They could have complete control, they could have no control, or they could have mixtures of the amount of control. So this is what it looked like. Let's give you a fast view of what this looks like. This is 100% control. This is when they have no control. And this is 50% control. So that was all pretty fast, of course. But after a while, people got the hang of it. And this is for normal subjects, looking at what people thought their amount of self-agency was compared to how much they actually had. And it's pretty good. Then one can look at what the MR is, the brain's activity, in relation to the proportion of agency that you have. And these are the activations. There's a widespread network of activations that are relevant in this regard, scattered through the brain, particularly in this region of the right side temporoparietal junction. That's the most active, but there are lots of different areas. There's a whole network of areas that are relevant. I won't go into more detail about it. But I want to tell you about patients that we have who have a functional movement disorder, functional tremor. If you don't know about functional movement disorders, that's what Freud studied. You could call it conversion, hysteria, lots of different names for this. This functional tremor, it would be a tremor that looks voluntary, but the patients say it's involuntary. And one of the things we've been trying to understand is how can they have lost the sense of voluntariness in this particular situation. So we had a series of patients who who could mimic their tremor so that it looked the same as their involuntary tremor. And we compare what looked the same when it was voluntary and involuntary for them. And that's what we did here, eight subjects, and the major difference was the right temporoparietal junction. So there was an abnormality of the right temporoparietal junction in these patients, and this seems to be, on the face of it, an explanation of why they have a failure of the sense of voluntariness, given the fact that their mechanism for appreciating agency is abnormal. We have just recently finished that same experiment with the hand in these patients, and while subjectively they do relatively well, the pattern of activities in terms of the regions of the brain activated are the same. They don't modulate the activity in the temporoparietal junction correctly. This is even in this particular situation. So these patients have a problem with their network giving rise to the sense of agency. I won't show you all the details. We believe that the main problem in the patients is a failure of feed-forward signaling. I won't go into the details. I can answer that a little more later if you want. But it comes out in this network of the appreciation of agency. Just then final point then is dualism. I don't think that people believe that anymore, although I wrote a question mark for this audience. And there's a weak form which I think is a problem, and that is our language contains implicit dualism. You hear people say, your brain knows before you do that you'll be making the movement. That sort of stuff doesn't make sense to me. Basically, you are your brain. To say that you and your brain know at different times doesn't really make any sense. This notion that you are your brain is a #1 bestseller in the Netherlands. This is something that is not a strange concept. So the interpretation of free will is basically, is the brain free to choose what to do? I don't think you have to worry about consciousness in this circumstance. Ordinarily, brains do that, except in some circumstances, such as seizures, psychosis, external coercion, or something of that sort. And I think the question is this part of the brain operating normally? And if it is, then you can say that there is brain freedom to make the movements. So I'm going to just skip the last point and say I did summarize most of this in an article in Annals of Neurology in 2016 if you want to read more details about all this. So thank you.